Hey there! Today I'm going to be making a video on this arena endgame tier list that I made. I'm going to be going unit by unit, bit by bit, explaining everything about the units, how to counter them, how they fit in the meta, and in general how they work. So let's get started, shall we? First I want to explain a little bit about the meta itself, because that's really important. So you're probably starting Brownless right now, and what happens is arena is completely different now compared to endgame. As the units get stronger and stronger, everything kinda changes, and you might have a lot of misconceptions regarding these units based on your early game experience. So first of all, I want to address that units will go stronger, but defenders don't really grow as well as attackers do. The reason for that is, well, let's say at late game, the defenders are gonna tank twice as much. Well, that's fine. By comparison, when we take runes and skill ups in consideration, the attackers are also going to be doing twice as much damage. That sounds fine. But then the supporters are also going to be supporting your attacker units twice as well. So it's like your attack units are 4 times stronger instead of 2. So in the end, what happens is you run usually 2 support units to your attackers, and in the end they become really strong. So late game, you're going to have way stronger attackers compared to defenders. Right now you see a lot of defenders that are just huge walls and you cannot go past them. Let's get Seer for example. She heals every time she's hit, she gets armor, she does everything, and it's really difficult to go past her. But really late game she just gets one shot by a lot of units. What ends up happening then is that the meta is kinda shifted towards a different type of tank. You're not going with tanks that can take raw damage, you kinda try to cheese them in a different way. So for example, you have 100% defense units. Like Lillian, as I mentioned in the previous video. She is really good because she can reach 100% defense, and then she just doesn't take damage from anything at all, except fixed damage. Fixed damage just ignores every type of damage reduction, and is really good. Also you have someone like Lucius that has a specific mechanic called Death Guard. Death Guard is really strong because you pretty much don't die, you get no damage as long as you have the buff on you. And it's just even better than having 100% defense because fixed damage units can't even kill you. You're kinda unbeatable. So that's one of the reasons Lucius is so good. The type of attack units you want to bring to the table are also kinda different as you go. Because using units such as Angelica for example, they only hit 1 tile is too slow. You usually want units with big AoEs that can hit multiple units at a time. So to run units with only 1 square, you kinda need to have like a really good kit to back it off. Like Will does, which is a unit that hasn't released yet, but she's like really strong in career. But in general, units with very like small AoEs don't work too well right now. Also, I want to mention that mages for quite a while were really bad. The reason for that is that they are just really slow. They only attack every order turn, and usually they will just die before they do anything, and in case they do, they're just 100% useless. While warriors can do their thing right away, and if they die turn 1, well that's fine, they still attacked probably, right? And in general, magicians need to have like a really huge payoff to be actually worth using. I also want to touch a little bit on supports, because usually we don't use defensive supports. They used to be good a while back when we have like the grand meta that I'm going to be talking about later, but that's kind of the past right now. We don't really use defensive supports, we are mostly going to use offensive ones that buff your attack units. There are a few exceptions here and there, like John, which is a 4-star that gives taunt. And in Korea right now there's a 5-star support that does that, and wow, it seems to be really good. She works with Mamonir, it's kind of a new thing coming up, we're going to talk about that later as well. But let's start with the tier list itself, shall we? I'm gonna be starting with S and going down, talking about every unit. So starting with Edin. Edin is a premium unit, you cannot get him normally. The only way to acquire him is going to the mileage gacha, which is a 10% chance to get Edin, and the other 90% is just a random unit from the regular pool. Which is kinda bad because usually you want a mileage for a specific unit with guaranteed chance, right? But while trying to gamble for Edin, you only have a 10% chance, so getting him is quite hard. You can even consider him harder to acquire than Octos. But he is really strong. He has just such great raw damage. Like his damage really is that high. A lot of units try to like compensate by being just really tanky, have high numbers, but he just says no and kills everything that doesn't have 100% defense or Lucius. Volja is, in my opinion, well, adding 2.0. She's really good and works in a similar way. She just does a lot of damage, especially at plus 10. She has a way better attack range, hitting the back, and wow, 5 tiles, it's really strong. And on top of it, she's really safe. So she's definitely one of the best warriors in the game. Actually, the best warrior in the game, for sure. The only way you can kill her by counter is damage over time effects, like Slowen, the 3-star, and Hijin after his rework. But other than that, she just attacks very safely and doesn't die. Lucius, a lot of people have trouble understanding why he's so good. And that's understandable because early on he isn't really. But later on, as I mentioned, as unit starts one-shotting everything, having a unit that's guaranteed to tank the first hit and then he dies, he gets 4 hits of invincibility. That's 5 hits total. Being able to tank 5 hits total is huge in late game. Units like Seb will tank 1 and die. Aaron will take 1 and die. And he can take 5, so that's just amazing, right? Of course, some units won't really work like that. For example, Foxy gets really cucked by Seh. So Seh would tank a hit in that case. But really, in general, tanks without 100% defense or Death Guard aren't really gonna survive much. And Lucius has a lot of Death Guard. He's amazing. Also, because of the fact that he's only good because of the Death Guard itself, you can live in a 5-star level 1 whatever and he works just as well. So right off the box, +0, no awakening required, he's already great and does everything he needs to do. And Mamoni, she's like the polar opposite of Lucius. Instead of cheesing tankiness, she's actually tanky, the OG way. She just has a lot of HP, reduces a lot of damage with her counter, and regenerates health over time, everything with her energy guard mechanic. She's really tanky by herself, but when coupled with units that give damage reduction, she's even better. So she works especially well with units that give barrier, like John for example. Of course, the other synergy with John is the Taunt. She can work as a static tank, that's fine, but a lot of people want to use her with a unit that gives Taunt. So using John with her is really strong. And recently in Korea we got a 5-star unit that does the same as John, as I mentioned. And that is absolutely meta right now. Using her Mamoni is just way too strong and a lot of units have a lot of trouble killing them. Like Valji at +10 and adding around 2 are the only units that can one-shot her. Other than that, if you don't have those 2, or Levi of course, you're just not gonna kill her at all. And to top it all, she also does a lot of damage for Defender. Levia recently got a rework. She used to be the worst Octave for sure, but right now she's just really good. She has the same effect of killing every unit in the game, but now at +10 she gets even more range and you don't need to invest as many skill books to get the one-shot effect. Also now she can one-shot energy guard units, which right now are Mamone and Velfen. She's really good on her own, especially if you +10 her, but she can also work really well with Velfen, with a little combo that usually, like to counter Velfen, which is a really good mage, people will use Taunters at the last turn. So at the start of the second round, that unit will have the Taunt without you having to attack, and that kind of counters him because he cannot attack your team and wipe everyone out. But with Levia in your team, you can just make her go first, kill that Taunter, and then Velfen is free to wipe the enemy team. Speaking of which, Velfen is also really good. He's probably considered by many the best mage in the game right now. Skip 3x3, energy guard, defense ignore, debuff immune unit. He's just absolutely insane. He has everything. He works really well. And as I mentioned, for magicians to work, they really need to have a huge payoff when they go out. And these two, like, they really do. Moving on to supporters though, you might expect something a little bit different with Asmodus, because supporters usually support units, but Asmodus is kind of different in the sense that he unsupports the enemy units, something like that I think, I don't know. In the end he just works as an attacker. Really, in the end what he's doing is killing the enemies. He does current HP % damage, which is pretty good, and at +6 he starts becoming a beast. Before +6 though, he is just really bad, because he's just gonna hit the units, not do enough damage, he's gonna like hurt them a little bit, which is usually not enough in this game. Like hurting people isn't good, you want to kill them. So he just doesn't really work well until +6, which is the reason why he's one of the worst octos to reroll for. Actually, the worst octo to reroll for. Well, Lavia works from +0, Lucius works from +0, Voucher works from +0. Of course, as I mentioned, Lucius is great at +0, he does everything he needs to do, and people don't usually go past that. And with Voucher and Lavia, you do want to keep going. But Asmo, he just doesn't even work, you don't even want him in your team at +0. And until +6, he's just dead weight, which makes him really slow to start with. Though later on, after you get your +6 and +10, wow, he's really good. He can be countered by defense units, and that can kinda suck at times, but in general, he's really good. Moving on to the A tier. Foxy is currently the best warrior you can acquire because Eden isn't really a normal unit, he's premium as I mentioned, and Voucher is an octo. So in general, for the normal units, Foxy is the best right now. She can be quite inconsistent at times, but she's just really strong. She hits 2 tiles, skips, does extra damage via chain explosion, has a counter. She's just really solid. Especially because she has multi-hit, and multi-hit really counters Lucius, because his energy guard counts every time a unit hits you. So multi-hitters will hit multiple times and deal more damage, let's say, to his energy shield, to his death guard, which is pretty good. It's also worth mentioning that multi-hitters are more reliant on support than regular units, and also they are worse against curse counter. So units like Seh counter Foxy really hard, and with a bunch of her around, Foxy might kinda get really screwed. Seto is also really good. He has quite a niche in the sense that he's one of the only units in the game, well, one of the only good units in the game that can counter kill Voucher. He has a regular counter that does damage and a burn counter that just works really well against her. He also has a skip ignore defense damage, which is really good, especially because in the global server we are not going to be getting many defense ignore units. Like the usual ones are Alec, Seto of course, Dalvi, which sucks, what else? That's it, right? There aren't many warriors that ignore defense. In past servers people would have Alec, people would have Seto, but right now it's not really worth to start with those units. So what ends up happening is that the server doesn't have many defense ignore, which means, well, 100% defense units are even better. Which means investing in those niche units that have defense ignore is actually better as well. So it's not even that bad as it sounds, right? Because a lot of people are going to be running Lilian, Archon, these 100% defense units because they are quite exploitable right now. No one is going to be able to counter those with defense ignore, except mages of course. But we're talking about warriors, right? And in the end, it's just really good to kind of counter the counter meta by running defense ignore units when everyone else doesn't. So he's pretty good because of that, and in general he's a really solid unit. Well, Seh, you know about her. She's the queen of PvE, she's the best unit to start with, of the regular pool of course. She has like very strong soloing abilities for PvE after you get her some skill ups. And in general she can be quite solid for PvP as well. She has a conditional 100% defense skill, which is pretty cool, but in general it's kind of inconsistent, so don't really put your bets on it. She's a taunter. Taunters are great because Velfun is gonna dominate the meta, and as I mentioned, you really want a taunter to go last, so at the turn 2, when mages attack, you have a taunter ready. So those two are quite interesting because of that. The other option is Atom. He's really good as well. He's quite tanky in general, and will tank some units that Seh cannot, while Seh tanks units that Aaron cannot. In the end, they are quite good, quite comparable. Choosing which one you're gonna go for is kind of debatable. People will usually go with Seh because she's good for PvE and everything, but I don't know, I feel like Aaron is just as good as an option for PvP. And if you only care about PvP because you can clear PvE with other units without Seh, well, Aaron is a great choice. He also has counter damage which can kill quite a few units, and it's pretty good. There are no magicians in this tier, so let's move to supporters. Well, Refi is a really good supporter. She gives counter damage and a lot of offensive buffs which are really good. The problem with her is the same as I'm gonna be mentioning for every other unit, Seto included even. That, well, they are good, sure, they can work, sure, you can invest in those, sure, but really, you shouldn't be. Because if you can just pick Velfen or Mammoni with ancient coins and invest in those instead, you definitely should. Those are just plain better. Of course, options are nice. You have these options, they are okay, you can go for those. But really, going for the AC Octos or any Octo that you start with is in general more efficient. Believ is one of the Octos as well, but she falls to the same problem as Refi. She is really good, she's absolutely unique and I love her skill set. But in the end, it's not really worth to go for her when you can't go to the other ones. Benaka is right now the best support that you can get through normal methods. She's really good, though later on there are better options that will come from Korea. For example, Wulia and Laura are also very strong. So you do not necessarily want to go for her, though she's still one of the best supports in Korea right now. Which one is the best is kind of debatable, but all the three perform really well. So it's nice to check the other two out, so you don't invest in Veneka now and kind of regret because you wanted one of the other two when they release. She's quite unique in the sense that her buff lasts forever pretty much. She heals, which is kind of lame, but it's, I'll take it, why not? It's kind of bad, but anyways. And she also removes any impairing effects, movement impairing effects, is that how it's called? I don't know, attack impairing or whatever. She's pretty good because of that as well. In general, her kit is really solid. Her offensive buffs are also quite high. She does not buff crit rate, which is something you might want to consider when building runes for your attack units, but in general she's absolutely great. Her main buff can also not be dispelled, so she's particularly good against units that have counter that dispels stat enhancement buffs. Moving on to the B tier. Lek is also a defense ignore unit. He's very similar to Seto in that sense, though I think Seto is just straight up better. Though he falls to the exact same problem, he's not really worth investing considering there are better options, right? Moving on to Jin. Jin is really interesting. He's like a 5-star version of a Bomba. He's not really gonna survive damage late game. You can't really just put him in the battlefield and expect him to survive against all the other warriors. He's just gonna get one shot, that's bound to happen. But wow, he kills back and it's pretty good. In general, he works as a premium Bomba. Sieg used to be quite comparable to Foxy. Actually, for quite a while he was significantly better. But the meta has changed and right now he's still similar to Foxy of course, but he's just worse. I would consider Foxy over him any time now. He only hits once, he doesn't have that much damage, and the fact that he's tanky doesn't really work nowadays with everyone doing so much damage. He's just gonna get one shot anyway. Though of course he's still really good. He is worse than Foxy, that's alright, he's still great and a very worth unit. We have Arkan. Arkan is very similar to Lilian in the sense that he's an 100% defense unit. The only thing that I don't like Arkan, and could be the reason why you don't want to invest in him, is that most of what he does, Lilian can do at +3, while he needs +10 to work properly. So, well, while being pretty good and potentially better than Lilian, Lilian does 90% of what he does without as much investment, so why wouldn't you just pick Lilian and use her, right? Which one of the two is actually better is quite debatable, and I don't really want to get to that topic. Gran. Well, Gran used to be a great unit. There's this very specific strategy with Gran, Celia and Raphitea. They have a set bonus, which is pretty decent, which gives Gran even more HP, and used to be one of the best strategies in the game actually. It was quite a defensive deck. You could tank a lot of hits, it was the go-to option for defensive teams. Though right now, with all this damage from warriors, it just doesn't hold up at all. I mean, some people still use Gran right now, and she can definitely work if mixed correctly with other Octos, and it's generally a very different from what it used to be. You just go quite offensive and use her as a regular counter. The problem is, she needs +10, Refi needs +10, Celia needs maybe +5, but you can use her at +0 of course, but in general it's a very expensive set for no payoff at all. So absolutely no reason to go Gran and Global. It's just for the very old players that had her when she was good and still try to implement her in the current teams that they have. Lilian of course need +3, once she does you give her 50% defense runes and she reaches 100% defense, which makes her amazing. She tanks for the entire 2 rounds except if there is fixed damage units, of course, attacking her, but in general she's gonna tank a lot. And because of the fact there aren't as many defense ignore units as I mentioned, she's just absolutely great. Celia, of course, part of the set. She's not really that good standalone, though some people try to make her work and sometimes it functions well. She's still quite alright, but not really overpowered or anything. She's a fusion unit, so you can kind of acquire her without paying with ancient coins, but in the end you have to waste mileage on her anyways. And I don't know, I wouldn't recommend it. She's only at this tier because the Grand, Celia, or Effie combo still works if you implement it well with Octos and everything, but it's really only for the old users. We starting a global right now shouldn't really be going for those three. Well, Verona is quite interesting. She's really unique in the sense that she supports a single unit, gives the buff immunity, which is really huge, and quite decent offensive buffs. In the end, people in Korea don't really use her that much, though people in Japan really love her for some reason. But in Korea, people don't really find her that good, because you're wasting an entire support in your team just to buff a single unit or make it less vulnerable for having debuff immunity. You could just run any other support instead that would just buff all your DPS units instead of a single one, and well, that's pretty much better, right? Though she still has her niches. If you use her with Voucher, for example, that can definitely work, because you fix all the weakness she has. Same thing for Foxy, she's really Verona hungry, but in general, really late game, you wouldn't really be using Verona that much. Mary is one of the options you have as a support. She used to be paired to pair with Venica, but as time passed she just dropped a little bit. She's good, she's one of the best 3x3 supporters you can have, but with better options such as Venica, the two upcoming units that I mentioned, I don't see a reason to invest in Mary unless you're really into 3x3 supports, which I am by the way, I love him, but still, I wouldn't really invest in Mary, having Venica, having new supports coming really soon that are just better. Though of course she's still in a quite solid tier, she does work well, she is strong. Now moving on to the C tier, I'm gonna be going a little bit faster so this video doesn't take forever. All these units, Eliane, Christina, Victor, Elijah, Rogan, Dwayne, Gunther, except Angelica, I'm gonna talk about her separately. All these units over here fall into the same category, that they are solid, they can work, you can use them in your team after you have your core kind of done, but as the first unit to build, you definitely shouldn't be looking at those. They can work, they are alright, but they aren't really the units that are gonna push your team further and really carry you, so keep that in mind. A lot of them require some special effort to work. Like Elijah for example, she's quite the anti-meta unit. The second mid-turn counters start becoming meta, she gets better and better. And also, units that buff themselves get quite countered by her as she has Nullify. Victor has quite the unique attack range. Christina is really nice, she covers a huge range, but she doesn't have that much damage. If she hits the tanks, she's not gonna be doing much. Though it's really nice to jump into enemy formations and clear 3 of the most important units, though it doesn't happen all the time. Rogan was recently reworked. He was pretty bad, nowadays he's usable. One is also quite interesting, he has quite a nice attack range, though that's about it. His damage based on buffs on the enemy doesn't really work that well nowadays. Gunther is quite an exception as he's a fusion unit, so early on you really want him. If you can fuse him early on, as you get Inno, he's just extremely powerful. He's great at PvE, really helpful in general, and you can use him in PvP for quite a while. So for new accounts, new players, he's absolutely recommended. Though you shouldn't really be investing skill blocks into him. Eliane, well, I don't know, she's okay. Now we have Angelica over here. Angelica used to be one of the best units in the game, if not the best unit in the game, and now she's just quite mediocre. Her damage reduction doesn't even matter nowadays, she is gonna die if she gets hit by a warrior. She's right now really bad, do not invest in her. Diomoro is quite an interesting unit. He's also a counter, but he has some niche usages. Both his base attack and counter have damage over time, so he can be used to count Voucher for example. As she attacks him, he gives her the dot and she dies later on. Also, some people in Korea tried going early with him, like the first unit, so he would hit Reckless, which is a unit that isn't released yet, but just take my word for it, it counters her and she's gonna be quite meta for quite a while. Nautilus is interesting, he has a very unique attack range, though most of the times he's just gonna hit a tank, like either Lucius in a lane you already cleared, or the star lane of the enemy, or he's gonna hit a Taunt and do nothing. So the dream of just wiping the entire enemy lane doesn't happen often, so he's not really that good. Ai is awesome, as I mentioned in the previous video. She's so good for new players in the sense that she only needs +0 and she does most of her damage. After Awaken, her additional damage actually scales with the monkey debuff that you give to your enemies, so she just does absolutely massive amounts of damage to units that get turned into monkeys, which are units without debuff immunity and without attack interference immunity. So for those units she just one-shots pretty easily, and she does hit the backline in a 3x3, which is just fantastic. In the end she kinda falls off in late game, but early on, oh boy is she good. Heejin got recently reworked in Korea. He's still not buffed in global, but I am gonna be considering the reworked versions as they should be coming out to global really soon. Heejin also counters Valje because he does have a damage over time counter, which is pretty good. In general he does way more damage, his attack range is quite alright, he's okay. Anubis is quite niche. He's only really good because he has Taunt Ignore, which can be quite good in Taunt heavy metas. Though the second Taunt has stopped being used too much, he's just not really that good. Moving on to Famous. She was quite meta for a while in Korea until the meta flipped and she's just pretty bad right now. She buffs everyone becomes tanky around her, it's amazing. But nowadays with so much nullify from Valje, from Foxy, and people doing so much damage, like trying to tank the OG way won't really work, like with damage reduction and higher HP, it's just not gonna work. People are gonna do enough damage, just one-shot anything in her range, so it doesn't work as well. Elena is quite interesting as well, because she has Charm Counter, which sounds good at first, but it's not really that good. If you consider most units have debuff immunity in the current meta, most of them aren't gonna get affected by her, and even the ones that are, like Valje and Foxy for example, they're usually just gonna get cleared by Benaka or any other support that clears that kind of condition. So it's not only hard to apply the charm to the enemies, but even if you do, it will just get cleared most of the time. So getting the charm effect off is quite hard. As I mentioned with Heejin, she got reworked very recently in Korea and that should be arriving global soon, but even after rework she's not great as you can see. She works similarly to Mary, but Mary just has better offensive buffs, while she has the payoff of having the charm counter, though the charm counter doesn't matter at all in the end, so I wouldn't really recommend her, unfortunately. Let's go a little bit faster now. So D. Ventana. She's quite interesting for Guild War and only for Guild War or any other content where you can see the enemy units before fighting them. So that could extend to like Mystic Island and depending on how well you play, Underground Arena as well. She's a taunt killer. The enemy taunts, she kills the taunt. That's pretty much it. She's not really good in Arena because it's too inconsistent. Most of the time she's not gonna hit a taunt and her base attack without hitting the taunter is just really weak as it only hits a single unit. Kinda is interesting, she's underrated in my opinion, I would put her a little bit higher, but I generally went with the consensus from the community and not my own opinion with this tier list, and people tend to rate her quite low. She's like a Yurong 2.0, which is quite interesting. You might find, okay, that's pretty good, right? And she is pretty good, I think. But what happens is very soon, probably in the next batch of units, we're getting a unit that is very similar as well, called Hania. And well, Hania is just way better, so... Moving on to Zenith, she is really interesting. She just can't tank at all. She doesn't have the capability to tank any units, she's gonna get hit and she's gonna die, unfortunately. That's just the meta we live in, but that's fine. When she's hit, she gives the taunt debuff to the enemy, so this can be used for quite a few 200 IQ strategies, so she can be quite good for Guild Wars, Mystic Island, though that's definitely not a relevant content at all, and of course Underground Arena. Cecilia is also quite interesting for those modes. She can counter some units really hard, and in general she's really handy to have for PvE. She makes quite a few difficult encounters trivial, which makes her quite interesting for new players. Though in Arena, same thing, she doesn't really pack a punch, she just gets one shot 100% of the time, and try to negate the AoE from the enemy is not always gonna work the way you want it to. Moving on to Glacia, she's a taunter, she's worse than the other taunters, she's bad. Now I'm gonna be talking about these magicians over here all at once. Actually, these ones as well. So, what happens with these magicians is that, as I mentioned, they really need to pack a punch in general to be worth using, because they're quite unreliable being magicians, so they need to do something quite good for your team, otherwise they're just not worth using. If you go to the trouble of using them, and even if they go off in the end, well, it's not really gonna win the fight for you. Valtor and Bafody try to be more tanky, same thing with Elise, right? But they just can't tank at all with the current meta, so that's kind of disregarded. And their base kit is kind of bad when it comes to being a magician in general, and the other ones just don't really do enough. Now coming back to E, starting with warriors, Pharaoh is a world boss unit, and as all world boss units, they don't work in any PvP type of content, though of course he is good for world boss. Though this guy himself can be quite expensive, so a lot of people just use the 4-star version instead and skill it up with dupes. Dalvi is horrible, she is really bad. She's an inconsistent fixed damage unit. By the way, I probably said ignore defense a few times and then fixed damage a few times, but I mean the exact same thing, even though defense ignore is kind of a mechanic in its own. Let's just disregard that. I always mispronounce these two, defense ignore and fixed damage. I mean the exact same thing, okay? So she ignores defense, does fixed damage, sometimes she doesn't. It's super inconsistent. You can't really predict her behavior after the first few rounds. She can't really tank in Fox form, and in general she's really bad. Barber is also interesting for the types of content where you see what the enemy is using. She's used to counter units that have counter damage. In general she's really bad in arena as well, as you may expect. Now all of these over here, if you look very closely to them, you notice they are all really bad. Moving on. Floria. No, just kidding. Like, they don't do really much except for tanking, and they tank really poorly. Amazing. Now I want to talk about Gloria specifically because she can be used in Guild War as well. With her effect, she can counter units that have taunt without debuff immunity because she silences before the enemy hits her. Though in general, Grace, the 4-star alternative, is just better than her, so there's no real use to use her in Guild War instead. It's only really useful when the enemy has like 2 different taunts that you want to counter, and so you can use one Grace and one Gloria, but in general she's not really good. Now moving on to Floria. She is a defensive support, and as I mentioned, those aren't really good. She used to be quite meta with the Grand deck that I mentioned, but with time she got nerfed hard and she's just really bad right now. Sabrina is terrible for arena as well, though she is a world boss unit and she is great for world boss, so you definitely want her as well. She's fusion, you should get her. Michaela has a very unique skill. She's basically a support only for atrocious wrath units. For any other unit, it just doesn't really work. Her idea is to deal damage to the unit so it's below 100%, so the units with atrocious wrath are going to do extra damage, which is pretty cool, but there aren't many good units with atrocious wrath right now, and it's kind of a support that only works in that specific team, so in general that doesn't work nowadays. So that's pretty much it. Keep in mind this tier list considers units at their best, so optimal synergies, optimal runes, optimal pluses. Like for example, you could consider Lillian for example at +3 or I at +0, but in general I'm considering all units at +10. So even if they are not efficient, for example I said like definitely do not +10 Alec. That's simply because he's not worth it. Doesn't mean at +10 he's bad, he's still a B. If this was like a what units are worth kind of tier list, he would be at the bottom of course. So I'm just really considering power over here. Hopefully this has revealed every unit you could be interested in, and also gave you kind of a sneak peek of how endgame PvP is gonna look like. See you guys.